So there's been an inherent and long-standing issue within all combat styles, I think, since the 20th century. That issue being the preservation of the style's origins and specific uniqueness. This has often stemmed, I think, from three major factors: living tradition, where a style is passed down through teaching and heritage rather than written word; styles that have become extinct and are now trying to be resurrected; and lastly, a sense of cultural and or nationalistic pride that sees the combat style as a staple or signature of that culture and or nation. In all of them, they have in one way or another come into conflict with the progressive wave of modernity, or basically the idea of that constant state of evolution in eras, peoples, cultural interactions, circumstances, and thus leading to different ways of fighting and killing. And different places handled that challenge differently. For example, in Europe, what often happened was once better weapons came along, like muskets, cannons, and other firearms, many melee weapons, such as longswords, maces, shields, sword and buckler, and so on, became obsolete for the most part and began to disappear from the front lines. Exceptions were made, such as sabers, which were used by officers, and knives, daggers, and bayonets, and something that will happen in other cultures as well, that sometimes swords would become more ceremonial rather than active combat use. But overall, you stop seeing these weapons on the battlefield. Another example is in Japan, where melee weapons didn't disappear with the introduction of firearms, but they did start becoming secondary weapons, or, as I said earlier, ceremonial. Contrary to popular opinion, katana blades were often seen as secondary weapons to begin with because, naturally, soldiers prefer to use longer range weapons such as bows and spears because of the obvious advantage in range before they started using their swords and knives and whatnot. But that being said, that still kept them in use. Now, in many countries across the whole of Africa, the martial tradition continued in spite of these advancements in armory and weapons and whatnot, such as the Thai invasion of Ethiopia. The maintaining of these styles themselves were often seen, I think, as another form of resistance to colonizations and their Western/European influence, thus holding on to their own specific tribal identity and so on. Now, in 2024, we see ourselves exposed to a whole new plethora of different styles for us to learn at our disposal, simply by pulling up a YouTube video or using the internet to track down teachers across the world who may still teach these limited known styles. And what I'm seeing as a reaction to this multicultural exposure is a reaction from some teachers, I think, of trying to stay in their own lane while keeping others out. For example, many kenjutsu schools will not spar with other styles for the sake of it because it's not part of their tradition, or low-key they may be trying to protect the style from embarrassment in case it gets defeated somehow. Or, in other cases, some hema schools refuse to teach weapons used in any other way other than what is written in the manuals, almost requiring a biblical level of loyalty to them, despite the fact that even historically those same styles were often fighting other styles during their time when they were mainstream, or were perhaps seen as being just as rebellious and radical as modern styles are seen today. In my opinion, the truth is simply this: that the only pure martial form of any style is the ones that are dead, and the ones that are still being taught or being brought back from extinction are destined to change regardless of the rules and the boundaries that we place on them. A pure style is a dead style means that when a style dies out for one reason or another, it no longer changes, it no longer evolves, because it's no longer encountering any kind of resistance or any kind of pressure testing from other things that are out there in the world. So then that when it stops, Then, like an insect that's captured in amber, it is preserved as it originally was, protected it in an odd way from change through its death. Yes, I know it's oxymoronic and weird, but that's how I see it. In contrast, any style that is still active today, even living traditions, is going to be constantly subjected to those pressures of change just by virtue of existing and living. You can't stop someone's body from changing as long as they're still living day to day and encountering the many forces that it has to deal with and live through, and that can impact it and what it can and can't do. So, therefore, any style, regardless of where it comes from, what sources it uses, or whatever, if it wants to be practiced today and in the future, is going to change. It is going to evolve, and it will evolve because of the different people coming into it with their diverse backgrounds. People who may have studied other martial arts in the past and that may bleed into those other forms, or different physical features that were different from the people who studied it back then. Japanese people were considered usually smaller on the norm, unless they happened to be samurai or large samurai. People coming from backgrounds with other martial arts skills that they may have done in the past, or with other physical abilities or traits that weren't around when the style was originally practiced as a mainstream technique. And also, too, the fact that nowadays finding a school or a teaching of some sort of style is not limited to just coming from one particular person. You can go to a school to learn something and then look up that same style on YouTube, for example, to study that same thing, and you may get an entirely different perspective on it. All these things are going to affect how that tradition and style is going to continue forward. It's going to change. I mean, if you're being honest about it, the very fact that as soon as you teach that style to another person at all, just one person, means that that style has already changed, because that person more than likely will not do it the exact same way that his teacher did. So my point being is that any martial art, period, that is going to continue is going to change and is going to evolve. And in my opinion, I think that should be embraced and not rejected. This doesn't mean forgetting the past and where it came from and its origins and whatnot, but at the same time, it also means not being so close-minded if someone happens to do it differently or has a different interpretation of it.